the western horizon lit up with the strobe of heavy artillery. At 08:55, the fortress guns joined the fight, their deep, earth-shaking reports rolling across the battlefield like the footsteps of giants. The fortress's rounds landed among the siege engine's escort troops, scattering them like chaff, shattering black iron armour and leaving craters deep enough to swallow a wagon. The lone surviving battery of St. Varrick's Fist worked in perfect counterpoint with the fortress. The gun crew moved like a machine. Rammer, loader, elevation, fire. Each action as precise as a heartbeat. Between each shot, Sister Cassian laid a gauntleted hand on the shell, murmuring blessings that mixed with the acrid smell of powder. The new Antioch Guard, positioned in a crescent in front of the pit, absorbed incoming fire with their shields. Enemy bullets, crude iron javelins, and shrapnel from stray explosions hammered against their wall. But the formation held. The mud at their feet was thick with water and blood, yet they stood firm, the line unbroken. From his vantage point, Major Irvine could see the enemy trying to adapt, shifting their formations, probing for a weak point, attempting to bring up more of their infernal artillery. Each time they massed in the open, fortress guns answered, the impacts so violent that even the faithful in the trenches flinched. The coordination between fortress and field gun was like a duet. One voice, thunderous and slow, the other sharp and precise. Together, they kept the eastern advance crawling, breaking its momentum again and again. In the Garrison HQ's inner yard, Captain Marlowe's jaw was set like stone. The counterattack was risky. Every man sent into the trench line risked being cut off if the enemy rallied too quickly. But the HQ's perimeter could not survive another push without reclaiming ground.
All companies, form for the counterattack! Push them back to the old barricades!
His voice cut through the din like a whip crack. The yeoman infantry were first to move, rifles fixed with bayonets. Behind them came the last reserves from the western sector, men who had survived the brutal combat of the first and second trench lines that had been recovering within the HQ while the battle raged around them. The mortars in the HQ's courtyard switched to rapid fire, their rounds bursting just ahead of the advancing line, showering the Legionnaire trenches with mud, smoke, and shrapnel. The barrage blinded the defenders, just long enough for the faithful to close the distance. What followed was chaos. Men tumbled into trenches, stabbing, swinging, grappling, in mud so thick it sucked at their boots. Legionnaires fought in tight pairs, their weapon fire overlapping, forcing the faithful to strike low at legs or high over the rim. Rifle shots at point-blank range punched through breastplates. Knives slid between armor plates into exposed flesh. Some stretches of trench changed hands 3 or 4 times in as many minutes. By the time the counterattack slowed, the faithful had retaken most of the perimeter directly around the HQ. A Crusader banner was jammed into the firing step, its cloth torn, mud-stained, but still visible in the smoke. The banner of New Antioch flew once more. It was not a sweeping victory. The enemy still pressed from both sides, and every yard of reclaimed trench was a thin, wavering line. But for now, the HQ was no longer under immediate threat of collapse, and that meant Sector 4 still had a beating heart. By 0940, the hard-won stability of the past hour had begun to fray. The enemy, far from shattered, revealed its reserves. From the mist, beyond no man's land, new banners rose. Black cloth, stitched with bone-white sigils, the designs shimmering faintly in the damp air. Behind them, ranks of legionnaires, advanced in unnerving syncrecy, their armour unscarred, their weapons freshly oiled. It was not the remnants of a defence force pressing forward, but a fresh army. Captain Marlowe, standing on the HQ's forward observation platform, read their paces and spacing like a book.
They've rotated their front. They're refreshing themselves, wearing us down while keeping themselves vitalized.
The sight was mirrored on the east. From the fog bank emerged two basilisk siege engines, towering constructs of blackened steel, each bristling with ballistae, snaking flamethrower arms, and protruding artillery guns. From the east, the ruins of the fallen relay began to stir with the movement of smaller, faster formations, raiding companies armed with hook blades and quick revolver pistols. In the rear command shelter, von Tessen, who had survived the front trenches and with a small crew had managed to retreat back before being overrun by hellish forces. He had now taken up command within the fortress, the heart of the defence itself. He read the first reports filtering in from forward spotters. His hands rested on the situation table, the waxed paper map, dotted with pins and hastily drawn charcoal circles.
They will hammer the flanks. By the heart they mean to take hold,
he said, almost to himself. His voice was calm, but his eyes tracked the shifting tokens with the attention of a predator. At 09:52, the sector lit up under a rolling barrage. Shell after shell crashed into the lines, churning the trenches into geysers of earth and dust. The survivors of the relay defence, still holding that flank, were forced into cover as their parapets collapsed and duckboards shattered underfoot. Marlowe's voice came sharp over the field phone to von Tessen.
Eastern Trench is compromised. I need immediate reinforcement or we will lose the second line in 10 minutes.
The enemy advance followed with mechanical precision. Shield walls rose from the smoke, marching forward as one, their formation absorbing rifle fire and shrapnel with dull, heavy impacts. At first, the defenders' shots rang harmlessly off these anointed, the black iron fronts of their shields blocking the legionaries before they reached bayonet range. When they finally arrived at the trench, it immediately erupted into hand-to-hand combat. Von Tessen, realizing the direness of the situation, dispatched his remaining reserve company toward the east without hesitation.
Tell them to hold till the wall is gone, not before,
he instructed his aide. He knew the cost of that order, but also the price of failure. If the eastern trench falls, the fortress itself would be outflanked. By 10:05, the eastern defenders had been forced into their second trench line. The sector still held, but only just, and every moment was costing faithful lives they could not replace. The assault on the final artillery battery began at 10:12. Two basilisk siege engines opened fire with a volley of massive quirls, one of which punched clean through the Crusader Guard's shield wall and embedded itself in the trench wall behind, still quivering. The Guard regrouped instantly, but the breach in their formation had been made. From her place atop the fortress shrine's balcony, the anchoress watched the battle unfold. She stood between the great bronze bells and the open sky, her hands resting on the railing.
The East will not hold without the fist,
she said softly to no one in particular.
but the fist will not fly without blessing, and blessing costs time.
The centre had bent dangerously, but had not broken. At 10:25, the enemy revealed their intent. The eastern attack and central attacks had been hammers, meant to drive the faithful inward. Now the anvil fell. 3 converging assaults, striking the western sector. Each wave timed to follow the other before the defenders could recover. Marlowe oversaw the western defence.
Infantry,
he barked.
fire until they're in the wire, then meet them there.
The enemy poured into the killing fields. Their formation staggered to avoid the fortress's continuous bombardment. The anchorite descended from her balcony into the fortress yard, where the wounded lay in rows. She moved among them, her prayers quiet but constant, touching each brow with fingers marked in ash. When she looked up, her gaze travelled to the central banners, still upright in the smoke.
The heart must not fall.
She murmured, as though the words themselves could bind the line. Von Tessen's orders were curt and decisive. Companies from both flanks were pulled inward to reinforce the centre, despite the risks of weakening the outer lines.
We will lose the perimeter if we must,
He said.
but we will not lose the center.
The fighting in the central trenches turned savage, rifle fire breaking into grenade duels, then collapsing into brutal hand-to-hand struggle. The lines surged back and forth, sections lost and retaken in minutes. By 10:40, the faithful still held the centre, but their trenches were shallower, their numbers thinned, and every man knew the next blow was already coming. And by 10:50, the ground itself began to shake. The rumble was not the deep, brief concussion of artillery, but something longer, rolling and growing stronger with every heartbeat. Marlowe felt the vibration travel through the timber, bracing under his boots.
That's not bombardment.
He said,
It's them.
low enough that only the sergeant beside him could hear. From the fog, shrouded plains, beyond no man's land, shapes began to loom. Low at first, then higher, hulking and grotesque. The enemy's armour had come at last. First came their tanks, rectangular brutes clad in layered plates of soot-black steel, their flanks crawling with rivets, their fronts like open furnaces belching heat and sparks. Instead of artillery barrels, their main armaments were massive augers, rotating with slow, implacable grind, meant to chew through fortifications. Behind them rolled the golden calf altars, each like a moving chapel twisted into a weapon. Spires bristled with fixed guns, their fires open, with sacrifices writhing inside. Malak sending them his power. Between their treads hung chains strung with skulls, clattering like blasphemous wind chimes as they advanced. At 10:55, the Leviathan tanks hit the western trench lines. Their augers tore into parapets, ripping through sandbanks and timber, as if they were wet paper. Men scrambled to fire anti-tank rifles and lob bombs into their sides and treads. But the machines simply rolled forward, crushing wire, stake, and bodies alike beneath their treads. Marlowe's voice came hard over the wire to Von Tessen.
They brought the Leviathans east. Oh, shells are glancing off them. I need everything with armor piercing in this sector now!
Von Tessen did not hesitate.
Divert the fortress's Bastion 1 guns west.
He ordered.
Tell them to fire until their barrels glow. If the Leviathan breaches, they'll carve through HQ before we can pivot.
The Bastion guns opened fire, their heavy shells slamming into the lead Leviathans and peeling away plates of armour with deafening cracks. The first line staggered, steam venting from their rear, before collapsing into a trench it had just torn open. The second kept coming, crawling over its fallen brothers to continue the advance. At 11:05, the Golden Calf altars made their push on the east. Their guns hammered the trenches, each shot gouging deep craters, collapsing dugouts and spraying the defenders with stone and soil. Their fires flaming with newfound vigour at the bloodshed that was being wrought in the name of their Dark Lord. From the fortress balcony, the anchorite watched the east trenches buckle under the assault. Her voice rose, not in panic, but in relentless, steady chant. The men in the trenches, glancing back to see her unmoving against the smoke, found themselves standing straighter, their hands tightening on their weapons.
Saint's Fist, full charge.
She commanded to the fortress gunner.
Strike them down in his name.
The fist fired, the shells smashing into one of the golden calves, sending shards of iron and gold flying into the enemy ranks. The tank faltered, then veered, its tread grinding into a crater where it stuck fast. But the others advanced unhindered, their oil fires spreading like rivers of flame through the forward trench lines. As the Leviathans and golden calves pinned the flanks, a third kind of machine emerged. The breach engines, smaller and faster, their wedge-shaped fronts were sheathed in curved plating, deflecting incoming rounds as they barreled towards the central trench network. Each carried a crew of armoured anointed shock troops, who leapt down to assault any surviving defenders the moment the machine reached the parapet. Marlowe saw one of the breach engines slam into the central wire, its momentum snapping the posts like twigs. The forward hatch dropped open, and the black armoured troops poured out of the gap. He drew his sabre.
Hold the gap. If they open it, they'll pour through to the HQ.
The fighting in the breach was close and brutal. Bayonets against hooked glaives, trench shovels against iron gauntlets. The first wave of boarders fell back, but another followed, and another, the breach engines feeding the melee like a black river. By 11:20, Von Tessen had made the decision. Every remaining reserve would pull back to the inner trench ring around the fortress. The flanks were gone, the outer lines lost. The guns now fired almost point blank, the fortress walls shaking with each salvo. In the courtyard, the anchorite moved between the ammunition lines and the wounded, ordering every man who could still stand to the walls.
The stones will stand if you do,
she told them, passing boxes of rifle rounds and grenades up to the parapets. Marlowe was in the forward HQ trench when the first Leviathan broke into the inner ring, its auger tearing a gap wide enough for 2 squads to pour through. He rallied what men he could, revolver barking, blade cutting through the smoke and steam.
Drive them out!
He roared.
They'll not turn this place into their altar!
By 11:35, the battlefield was nothing but wreckage and fire. The enemy armour still pressed forward, though slower now, many of their machines crippled by the combined fury of fortress guns and desperate infantry. The trenches themselves had become killing pits. Mud, broken timber, and steel hulls mingled with the bodies of the dead. Von Tessen stood on the bastion parapet for the first time that day, surveying the chaos.
They have given us their worst,
he said, voice flat.
and we are still here, but then life will come next.
The anchorite, high on the eastern bastion, stared out at the smouldering wrecks scattered across the plain. Her great iron hands were covered in oil and rock, and bits of discarded shrapnel that had bounced off her steel plating.
Let it come.
She whispered to herself.
If this is the day we fall, we will not fall easily.
Marlowe's jaw was set as he reloaded his revolver. Somewhere beyond the smoke, he could hear the sound of enemy drones, slow, deliberate, and growing louder.
The machines were the storm.
He thought grimly.
The men behind them, and that's the knife.
By 11:38, the Garrison HQ was a place of constant shaking. Its tunnels quivered like the ribcage of a dying beast. The ceiling dust fell in thin, steady streams, settling on the shoulders of men bent over field tables. Each minute brought a new concussive slam from outside. Another enemy shell, another breach in the surrounding trenchworks. Marlowe had been sent forward to the outer HQ line at first light. He had not left it since. Now, through the foul smoke and the sleet of mud, he could make out the new push. Enemy infantry, in massed ranks, their banners low, advancing behind the squat shapes of the breach engines. These iron-plated monsters rolled forward on caterpillar tracks, wrapped in thick leather sheathing, each carrying a blunt ram head covered in hooks for tearing wire and timber.
Reload faster!
He barked, slamming a fresh cylinder into his revolver. A man beside him fired a trench gun into the mob, vanishing in a spray of shrapnel as a mortar round landed square in the bay. The parapet in front of him trembled, rammed by a breech engine. The wooden struts creaked, split, and burst inward, enemy troops pouring through the gap like water. Marlowe cut down the first man over the top, his sabre catching him bone, then wrenched it free as another came at him.
Back!
He shouted, knowing the breach was too wide to seal. In the Central Command dugout, Von Tessen stood, hunched over the sandbagged firing slit, one hand on the speaking tube to the HQ.
All positions forward of the HQ trench are gone.
He said evenly into the tube.
Repeat, gone. Begin fall back to Fortress Line A.
Marlowe turned to the remaining officers, less than half of those who had begun the day with him. Their uniforms were filthy, their eyes sunken, but they were still on their feet.
We strip this place bare.
Marlowe ordered.
Ammunition, water, signal equipment, everything that can be moved, you move. If it can't be moved, you burn it.
The enemy pressed from all sides now. They could hear it in the tunnels, the scraping of boots overhead, the thump of grenades hitting mud. The fallback began as an organised withdrawal and ended as a rush. Wounded men were passed along the west tunnel, ammunition, crates bumping off the wall as they were hauled to safety. Marlowe appeared last, blood on his temple, half dragging a man with a shattered leg. As they reached the final bend in the west tunnel, a thunderous crack shook the earth. Part of the eastern HQ wall had given way. The collapse rolled through the dugout like a wave, crushing what was left beneath with tons of stone. The survivors emerged into the sleet-ridden light, the fortress rising ahead like a black stone cliff. Between them and safety stretched the inner trench ring, already packed with a patchwork of defenders. Fortress Garrison, remnants of forward-line regiments, and the last active squad of faithful mechanized infantry. These hulking warriors, their armoured plates etched with devotional text, stood at intervals along the parapets like iron statues. Their exoframes hissed with each movement, the pistons pumping as they hefted heavy rifles the size of a man's arm. Marlowe staggered into the line, pushing the wounded man towards a medic.
How long have they been there?
He asked a sergeant at the firing step.
"Since dawn,"
came the reply.
"Haven't taken a step back."
The man nodded towards a mechanized trooper holding the junction.
"That one's been firing since we opened the day."
Von Tessen made straight for the West Bastion battery. The gunners were black with powder, the gun barrels steaming from the rain hissing on their heated steel. In the near distance, golden calf tanks, armoured engines shaped like the flanks of golden calves, crept forward under a pall of smoke.
Load solid.
Von Tessen snapped.
Aim for the thread. Immobilize them before they can reach.
The first shell struck the lead tank square, rocking it sideways. The second jammed its forward treads into a crater. On the third, the engine slid apart, spilling its cargo of chained corpses into the mud. The enemy infantry behind faltered, stepping over the bodies with a visible hesitation. By 12:15, the Legion made its next push, not with machines, but in sheer human mass. Lines of black-armoured anointed infantry advanced shoulder to shoulder, their boots splashing in the churned earth of no man's land. The mechanized infantry met them in the trenches, powered gauntlets swinging like hammers, splintering armour and bone in a single blow. Their very presence steadied the line. Men who had been swaying from exhaustion stood firmer with the great exo-armoured figures beside them. The Shrine Anchorite moved constantly along the firing step, her voice calm amid the chaos. She first pressed small reliquaries into hands, blessed ammunition belts, whispered prayers. Near the east bastion, she paused beside a kneeling rifleman, whose arm hung uselessly at his side. Taking the machine gun weapon from him, without a word, she rested it on the parapet and fired into the oncoming tide. By 12:25, the fighting in the inner ring had dissolved into knots of close combat. Grenades burst inside trench bays, sending bodies and shovels spinning through the air. Bayonets clashed in the choking haze, each thrust and parry a battle unto itself. Marlowe fought knee-deep in mud, his sabre black with oil and blood. Beside him, a mechanized infantryman swung his armored fist into an enemy chest, crumbling him with a single hit. Another climbed the parapet, only to be dragged back down by a faithful rifle butt to the jaw. Von Tessen's gunners were firing over open sights now, the range so close that shell fragments peppered the bastion walls.
We are at the edge,
He told his adjutant.
but remember, edges can cut both ways.
By 12:40, the fortress defenders had been pressed into the last trenches directly beneath the walls. The mechanized infantry were reduced to half their number, their armor dented and smoking, hydraulics bleeding oil. The defenders were nearly spent. Marlowe's voice was a hoarse rasp from shouting orders. The anchorite was streaked with soot, her robes and iron armor shredded, but she still moved with purpose, her eyes bright, her mechanical limbs marching forward step by step. Von Tessen surveyed the field one last time.
If there is to be salvation, it must come now.
He said to no one in particular. The enemy's chants were louder now, deep and rhythmic, timing each advance with the thud of boots in the mud. The fortress' inner trench ring was moments from breaking. Everywhere, the fight had slowed to a grinding, breathless exchange. Men were too tired to shout. Grenades were being hurled without aim, just to keep enemies' heads down. A thin mist of drizzle and cordite smoke clung to the earth, turning the air into something half liquid, half breathable. Marlowe stood ankle deep in churned mud, sabre hanging loose in his right hand. The blade was nicked and blackened, but his arm could barely lift it again. On either side of him, men reloaded with trembling fingers, or simply stared out into the smoke where the next wave would emerge. Beyond the parapet, the enemy was regrouping, lines of black-armoured infantry massing behind looming shapes of tanks, their plated flanks groaning as gears reset and track lines clattered into place. One more push and the line would split. Marlowe knew it. Von Tessen knew it too. From the west bastion's upper fire step, he could see the whole killing ground, the enemy consolidating, the fortress gunners down to their last belts and crates. Even the mechanized infantry bulwarks in the trenches were showing the weight of the fight. Piston limbs leaking oil, dented chest plates, and movement slowed by exhaustion. The shrine anchorite moved among the parapets without fear, her voice still calm, but quieter now, as if every word was costing her breath. She placed a hand on Marlowe's shoulder as she passed him. She said simply, it was not a request. Then, beyond the ruin-churned plains, came the deep bong of a bell. It rolled across the battlefield like a wave through water, heavy and resonant, cutting through the crash of guns and the hiss of rain. Heads turned involuntarily towards the sound. Another gong, slower than the first. Then another. Marlowe frowned, his chest tightening with something he couldn't name.
Bells?
Von Tessen, hearing them from his bastion, froze. He had been at enough sieges to know that bells this size were not mounted in any fortress. They were carried, swung from armoured procession wagons. The kind used only by
the pilgrims.
he muttered. The third toll was joined by a faint, rolling drumbeat, not the rapid, martial cadence of a marching column, but the solemn, deliberate tempo of a ritual advance. Came shapes in the murk, tall banners with metal tips that glinted like sparks in the dim light, moving in time with the drums. Beneath them marched men in heavy trench armour, painted with devotional script, each plate marked with the seals of penance or oaths sworn in blood. They carried their rifles at the slope, muzzles high, steps measured. And at the head of their column, walking with the steadiness of stone, came the shrine anchorites of the pilgrim path of iron, a dozen or more, each in heavy robes bound with chains, their staff topped with relics glowing faintly in the smoke. Behind them rattled low, track-driven reliquary carriers and pilgrim wagons, flanked by the bulk of fresh mechanized infantry, their exoframes gleaming with oil and unscarred by the day's fight. The sight spread like fire along the parapet. Men straightened, some began to shout, others simply stared, mouths open. The enemy paused mid-preparation, their tanks halting, infantry officers glancing at each other in disbelief. It seemed that in their last moment, Hal had managed to send out one last request, one last desperate plea for reinforcements, and the procession of the Iron Path had heard, quickly joined by a patrol of mechanized infantry. These new forces had rushed to the aid of the Ashen Trench. They were here to save St. Varrick's Fist. They were here to support their fellow faithful. They were here to fight. Marlowe felt it as something physical, like the tightening of a bowstring in his chest. He could barely keep the tremor of his hands as he slammed a new cylinder into his revolver.
They came,
He whispered to no one in particular. Beside him, the garrison's remaining mechanized infantry straightened to their full height, servos whining as if the machines themselves recognized the approach. The shrine anchorite at his side had fallen to one knee, her eyes closed in silent prayer. When she rose, there was a strange light on her metal facade. Not exhaustion now, but a kind of fervor that made her seem taller, her voice stronger.
Stand ready.
She told the trench.
When the bells cease, we strike.
The pilgrims advanced without haste, stepping over shell craters and burned out emplacements, the bells tolling at precise intervals. With each toll, the enemy line shifted back slightly, unsure whether to hold or fall away. Von Tessen's mind sharpened to a commander's clarity.
We will crush them between us.
He told his adjutant.
Bastion guns target their rear echelon. Do not fire on the pilgrim's path. Infantry, prepare to advance when I give the word.
The pilgrims entered the outer ruin field without breaking formation. Mechanized infantry in the van smashed aside wreckage to clear the way for the anchorites and their standard bearers. Rifles began to fire in precise rolling volleys, each shot placed and timed to disrupt the enemy's reorganization. At the 8th toll of the bell, the drums ceased. The anchorites raised their relic staves as one, the faint gold light swelling until it was visible even through the rain. Then, the columns surged forward. Mechanized infantry in the lead hit the enemy's right flank like a hammer, powered gauntlets caving in armor, rifles blasting at point-blank range. Pilgrim riflemen fanned out in disciplined lines, advancing in synchronized bounds, never firing without purpose. Von Tessen's fortress guns spoke a heartbeat later, shells slamming into the rear of the enemy, driving them forward into the waiting jaws of the pilgrim vanguard. Marlowe vaulted the parapet with the rest of the trench line, boots squelching into the soaked earth He struck the nearest enemy rifleman with the edge of his saber, spun and fired twice into a knot of infantry caught between the pilgrims and the fortress. Everywhere he looked, the enemy's formation was splintering. Cathedral tanks tried to pivot to face the new threat, but immobilizing fire from the bastions punched through their treads, leaving them to burn where they stopped. The shrine anchorite moved forward through the chaos, her staff raised high, not with the frenzy of a charge, but with the steady, unyielding pace of a funeral march. She stepped over corpses and shell fragments as though walking on temple stones, her voice rising in a litany that carried over the gunfire. Wounded defenders who could still walk joined the push, rallying to her voice, closing around her as a living guard. By the time the bells tolled the final time, the enemy was finished. Some tried to retreat through the wreckage of their own tanks, others threw down weapons and fled into the smoke. Mechanized infantry strode after them, cutting down those who lingered. Eventually, the fortress guns fell silent, replaced by the ragged cheer of the garrison and the deep, steady chant of the pilgrims as they secured the field. Marlowe leaned on his saber, chest heavy. Von Tessin emerged from the bastion, his boots heavy with mud, and offered a single nod to the pilgrim commander. The shrine anchorite knelt in the mud where the enemy standard lay broken, pressing her head to the earth.
The fortress endures,
she said, and for the first time that day, everyone believed it. The rain had stopped by the time the sun began to sink, but the smoke still hung over the killing ground. From the fortress parapet, Marlowe could see it all. The twisted hulks of enemy cathedral tanks, half sunk in the churned mud, the sprawled, black shapes of their dead, the trench lines, now empty, where hours earlier they had been crawling with the living. And in the midst of that silence, the first shovel began to bite into the earth. Pilgrim riflemen, their armour dulled by dust and cordite, were already clearing the way for forward positions, dragging wreckage into makeshift barricades, marking the ground for fresh entrenchments. Garrison survivors, pale and hollow-eyed, moved among them, accepting water flasks and spare rations with the wordless gratitude of the newly reprieved. Marlowe felt the ache in his limbs deepen as the adrenaline bled away. He wiped his saber clean and sheathed it, the motion slow and deliberate, like sealing away a chapter of himself. On the fortress's main mustering ground, Von Tessin stood atop a broken tank hull, his voice carrying without need for a trumpet.
We do not rest.
He told the combined force.
We dig. We relay the wire. We bring the guns forward. Every hour we gain tonight is an hour the enemy cannot take back tomorrow.
He pointed towards the outer killing field.
New trench lines will be cut there. Anchor them to the bastions. The pilgrims will hold the flanks until we rejoin the old works. Mechanized infantry will rotate between digging and watch.
There were no cheers, only a low murmur of assent. Everyone knew the enemy would come again. The shrine anchorite moved through the fortress yard, like a shadow of calm amid the restless labour. She visited each cluster of wounded, kneeling to anoint their forehead with a thin line of consecrated oil. Some she prayed over in whispers, others she only touched, letting the contact speak for itself. When she passed Marlowe, she paused. His tunic was torn, his gauntlets dented. She pressed a small relic, a fragment of bone bound in wire, into his palm.
Carry this in the next storm,
she said, as if the next battle were as certain as the rising sun. The re-establishment of the trench lines began before full dark. Pilgrim engineers laid out guide ropes in the mud, marking where the new parapets would rise. Garrison men drove pickets deep into the ground for the wire. Mechanized infantry knelt in the muck, their piston limbs hissing as they hauled timber into position for gun platforms. The sound of spades in wet earth became the heartbeat of the night. Now and then, a single rifle crack echoed from the forward patrols, a reminder that the battlefield beyond was not entirely empty. Marlowe found himself working beside a trench pilgrim from the procession's vanguard, a tall man whose helmet bore deep scratches from a near miss. They said nothing as they dug, passing the shovel between them when hands were tired. Behind the fortress, a wide trench was cut into the higher ground. Here, the dead of both Garrison and procession were laid out, boots aligned, weapons stacked neatly beside them. The shrine anchorite stood at the head of the grave, her voice rising in a long, slow chant of the right of the fallen. Pilgrim bells rang once for every 10 names read aloud, their sound carrying into the open night. Von Tessen stood beside her, helmet removed, head bowed, not in prayer, but in the silence of a soldier, acknowledging the cost of victory. By midnight, the first section of the new forward trench was ready for occupation. Wire coils glittered faintly in the lantern light, and the low silhouettes of firing steps and traverses cut the skyline against the burning wrecks beyond. Marlowe was among the first to take his post. The air was cold, his hands blistered from the digging, but the sight of the fresh works gave him a strange steadiness. This was ground they had taken back, ground they had bled for and reclaimed. Von Tessen made his rounds along the line, stopping at each post to exchange a word or a gesture of approval. The pilgrim riflemen stood at intervals between Garrison veterans, their presence a living wall of faith. In the small hours, a shrine anchorite came to the parapet where Marlowe kept watch. She looked out over the field where the fog was beginning to gather again.
This is not the end,
She said softly. Marlowe almost smiled.
It never is.
She placed her iron hand on the fresh timber of the firing step.
The line is ours. And tomorrow, it will hold.
For a moment, the world seemed still. Just the fortress, the trenches, and the quiet strength of those who had survived to see them rebuilt.